a narrow centralised structure or we have a flat structure. So these are not about how the organisation competes, but how the organisation is arranged. And obviously, they affect the competitiveness. So if your organisation was operating in a very dynamic, turbulent market where change was the norm, then the decision to have a narrow and centralised structure would create a very slow to respond organisation that would be very bad for competition. The city management saw that and said, okay, well, we've got a very flat structure so that we can respond quickly. We've got a decentralised decision making so we can respond quickly. Then that organisation will be able to respond faster and therefore become more competitive. So corporate strategy indirectly affects competitiveness, whereas business level strategy is focused on how the organisation will compete in a particular market, and functional level strategy underneath that is how each of the departments contributes to that business level strategy, what they do to minimise costs, what they do to increase differentiation depending upon the business level strategy. And as we talked about, I think the week before last, one of the problems is that all of these things take years to put in place. They don't happen instantaneously. You can't just turn them on, and the decisions are really made simultaneously. So you will inevitably see in any real organisation a business level strategy, or let's say a corporate level strategy, which is unfolding and maybe started 2 years ago, a business level strategy which has got some components from 4 years ago, which is still unfolding, and some new components from just 12 months ago that were adapted to try to make the organisation more competitive, and then a functional level strategy which has got a different time frame again. So if you take any snapshot in time, you will see bits and pieces of strategies from years in the past which are still unfolding, which are perhaps no longer even connected to the market anymore, but are decisions that were made in the past which are still being implemented. So we don't just have a strategy and then say, okay, well, we're halfway through implementing that, we're just going to drop it all and we're going to start fresh again. The only time organisations do that is when they're just about to go out of business. Otherwise, the investment that's been made in the strategy and the uncertainty around the environment is such that the organisation needs to see most strategic decisions through so that they can get the return from all of the change that they put into that new strategy. So corporate level strategy is the structural decisions, and we're going to have a bit more of a look at that. So in dealing with corporate level strategy, we're going to identify the different options, which include products and markets and so forth, and diversification in particular. We're going to focus on diversification strategies and the two different approaches for that. We're also going to focus on vertical integration. So diversification is horizontal integration. Vertical integration is to acquire or form partnerships perhaps up and down the supply chain. So you might buy your suppliers and you might buy your suppliers' suppliers, or you might have a distribution company that distributes for you. You might purchase them and increase the scope of the organisation. And usually organisations do that because they can create more value somewhere along the supply chain than where they are currently located. Then we're going to look at briefly about what in a diversified organisation the headquarters can do. So headquarters will usually include a couple of functions, some finance, maybe all of the finance, certainly strategy direction, and also maybe a little bit of marketing. So how the organisation, that head office, adds value or interferes with the business level strategy performance of each of its business units is something we'll look at, and then we'll talk briefly about business unit portfolio analysis. Okay, so some of the important things that we decide at the corporate level strategy level are scope, how broad to make it, how many different industries are we going to be in. The more related the businesses the organisation has, then the more it can share resources between them. But the broader the scope of businesses, the more different the industries it's in, the more likely it's going to have, it's going to even out the peaks and troughs that any individual industry experiences. Usually when one industry is on a downturn, another industry is on an upturn. So if you spread across enough industries, you'll have a relatively, overall, you'll have a relatively smooth ride. The issue of the headquarters, how can they add value? What's their functional role? And considering the matricity of business units in the portfolio, how do we make a decision about investment and divestment? Okay, so we've got a little Ansoff matrix. This is from the 1980s. It strongly leans towards corporate planning rather than response, and assumes that you can force your way into a market. It assumes that if you appear in a market, then you'll get business. But nevertheless, it's a good conceptual approach. So there's two dimensions. We've got what you do and who you do it for. So products and markets. And so Ansoff basically said there's four ways of approaching. If you've got existing products in an existing market, you just want to get more of that market. If you've got existing markets but new products, then you're going to try and increase your business in that market by selling new products. And so complementary services are a typical example. You might introduce a computer game console and it's just got a few games associated with it, but then you come up with a broader and broader range of games. You come up with games for brain development, you come up with games for health and things like that, which is what Nintendo did with their Wii, to increase the range of the scope of people that you're able to sell products to. Then you can move to entirely new markets. You can say, okay, well, we're in manufacturing, but now we're going to go into medical equipment, or we're in transportation, we're going to go into production or something like that. So moving into new markets with existing products, we used to do this in one market, we can do it in a different market. I think a good example of that is Uber, for example. So Uber was first of all around shipping people, transporting people, but then they introduced Uber Eats, which is a service that would pick up food from a takeaway restaurant and take it to you. So they're using the same products, which is individually owned private drivers, but they've introduced it to a new market where the private driver drives a pizza around now instead of an individual. And then you can have new markets and new products, which is just a complete and total diversification where the organisation says, okay, we don't want to invest anymore in what we're doing, but we do have the capacity to invest in new businesses. We want to spread our risks, so we're just going to do something entirely new. We might buy a company that we know is coming up because it's a good deal because of some economic conditions, or we might start something from scratch. So looking quickly at market penetration, basically that's just increasing the share of the market. It's as simple as that. Basically you just do what you do a little bit better. You promote, you maybe use your economic, financial power to make life a bit difficult for your competitors and cause them to pull back a bit. You do things like improve the functional areas such as the economies of scale, so you can do things a little more cheaply. You improve your processes. What's going to happen? Well, your competitors are going to say, well, we don't want to lose our market share to you, so we're going to replicate the same things you do and try and keep everything at a base level. So in highly competitive, and very mature industries, you find there's very small amount of juggling in market share. And so if you think of petrol stations, for example, one petrol company might offer a discount, so then for a few hours they have more market share, or it says, oh, I'll buy petrol from Shell because their petrol is cheaper at the moment. So the reaction of BP, of course, is to drop their prices, and then they regain equilibrium. So that's a normal constraint. Obviously, there are other constraints around exercising excessive market power. So if you decide that you're going to try to be dominant in the market, push all the competitors out, take various actions to get rid of them, and then you're the only supplier to the market, then the regulatory bodies in most countries, particularly developed countries, will say, no, we require a degree of competition in the industry. You're not allowed to go above a certain percentage of market ownership. And of course, then there can be economic conditions which will interfere with it as well. So if we look at the three dimensions of the Ansoff matrix, B, C, and D, you'll see that they're all around diversification. So diversification is about increasing what you do, increasing the range of products, increasing the range of markets. If it's related, as I indicated, then obviously you're doing a similar sort of thing. So related diversification around products means that you're selling the same products to someone else. And the benefit of that, as I've suggested, is that you can reuse your existing capabilities. You don't need to do anything new, so it's efficient. but the risk level is higher because you're investing more in doing the same. So if there's a downturn associated with that product or that activity that you do, then that's going to apply across the board. So you increase your effectiveness, but you also increase your level of risk. Whereas unrelated diversification, which Ansoff referred to as conglomerate, but that's a bit of an old-fashioned term, it still hangs around a little bit. Unrelated diversification spreads the risk, but you go back to square one because you don't know much about that new area. So you aren't able to use your existing capabilities, your existing strategic resources, your existing knowledge, but you are spreading your risk. So what's the answer? Of course, a bit of both. So quickly looking at new products, we can consider how related they are. So if we sold, say we sold trucks, and we sold trucks 1 and 2 kiloton payload trucks, we might start to sell 3 ton payload trucks. So that would be related diversification. Pretty much the same sort of thing, we're just extending the product range. Sometimes, however, we might require new strategic capabilities because there's no way of extending the existing products without doing something new. So we might add a new feature to our products that introduces new technology, which requires a new strategic capability to achieve that. Generally, this is all around project management at the functional level. It's about how efficiently you can extend the product range. And that's most of the risk is associated with whether the product is accepted relative to the investment you've made. Market development, similar sort of thing. Basically, we've got our products, they work very well in one market, perhaps another market would be interested in them. We usually need to make small adaptations to the product or the packaging or the way it's delivered or the conditions under which it's delivered. So for one product, for one market, people might purchase the product, but in another market, they might lease the product, they might take the product as part of a larger package. It's probably easier to sell what you do to someone else than to come up with something new. So it's probably even more strongly related than new product development to what you already do. So it's really just a repackaging or rebadging. And the most important thing is, though, that the new market will have different conditions to the old market. If you're selling more products, bigger product range to an existing market, then the key success factors for that market still apply. But if you enter into a new market, even with existing products, what the previous market, the original market, liked about those products is not necessarily the same as what the new market will think about those products. So if your product was a computer and it was the fastest computer on the market and you sold it to people who were intensive computer users, gamers or something like that, then they say, this is great because it's the fastest computer on the market. If you then sell it to retirees, something to do when they've retired, increased internet existence, they're probably going to look for other criteria. They're going to be interested in technological redundancy, how quickly it goes out of date. They're probably going to be interested in ease of use. They're going to be interested in physical robustness. So they just want different features in the product, and you can't say to that market, but it's the fastest computer in the market, because this new market, so we don't care about that. Is it easy to use? That's what we care about. So same product, different market, different key success factors. Then there is unrelated diversification, which is basically just all new. We're just going to do something else. So large organisations like GE, that sort of organisation, just do many different, totally different things, and the idea is that they spread their risk by having completely independent business units servicing wildly different markets with wildly different products. So what happens? If the diversification is too related or too unrelated, then we have problems. As I indicated, if it's all related, then your fortunes are dependent on the success of that particular product and possibly that particular market. If it's completely unrelated, then the organisation's capabilities are stretched across many different industries and products and markets, in which case you have a lower opportunity to build economies of scale and make high-level use of existing resources. So the optimal lies somewhere between the two. Not too unrelated that you're spread too thinly, but not too related that your risk levels are too high. So somewhere in the middle will provide the best overall performance. The reality for most organisations is far away from that, because business units are not like houses where there's plenty on the market at any one time. If you have take your university, right, we want to have some related diversification, we should buy another university. No on the market. We'll just wait a while. 12-month trader. Still no universities on the market. Okay, maybe we could build a university. All right. When we could build a university, where do we need one? Or we could build one in, no, there's already lots in New South Wales. We can't build any there. What about, no, there's plenty in South Australia. We could build some in Queensland, but there's lots being built there already. That's not going to be too good because there's lots of Queensland unis already know what's going on. Not sure where we're going to build a university. So the reality tends to be that the options open for building a new one or buying a new thing, business, which is exactly what you want, is quite low. So a university that was particularly excited about diversifying, said we want to buy something, we want to acquire something, might end up acquiring something related, but not in the same industry, such as a training college or maybe a supplier or something like that, because that an organisation in that category comes onto the market and they can purchase that. There's an opportunity to create one in that area. So the reality for most organisations is that their options are very limited in terms of what they can diversify into. And to say we're going to be right in that optimal point is very difficult to achieve in reality. Vertical integration, as I indicated, basically you buy your customers or your suppliers. Historically, organisations following the Industrial Revolution 100 years ago were very keen to own the whole supply chain, from the hole in the ground to handing it over to the final user. Same issue that we talked about before, very unrelated diversification. Digging a hole in the ground, running a manufacturing process, running distribution, running retail, they're very unrelated. So the resources are distributed across, you're going to need many strategic resources to cover that supply chain. So as time has gone by, organisations have become narrower and narrower and narrower, and just focusing on doing one thing better rather than many things. So generally the level of vertical integration of most organisations decreases. Then of course, as I indicated, the level of risk increases. So you see a bit of a pendulum where an organisation will contract and become quite small and then say, well, that was great, we're doing well, but our risk levels are really high. We're going to start to spread out along our supply chain, diversify a bit. Oh, that's good. Oh, this is really difficult to manage. We're not doing so well, we'll contract back. And so they tend to swing from being more vertically integrated to less vertically integrated to more vertically integrated to less vertically integrated as economic conditions and their performance drives them. But they're never static about these things because they can never find the right position. The world changes too much for any balance point in terms of the level of vertical integration to be sustained. So if we look at an example of cars, if you make cars, you can horizontally diversify by saying, well, if we can make cars, we can make trucks, and we can make trucks, we can make buses. So now we're making trucks for industry, cars for consumers, and buses for transport. That's three different markets that we're servicing with the thing that's got four wheels on it. It's not so, a car and a truck's not that similar, but there's lots of stuff that we can share. And when it comes to buying tyres and batteries and things like that, windscreens, that's pretty much the same. So there's certainly some of our capabilities can be used across that product range. So that's horizontal integration. Vertical integration is saying, well, we make cars and then someone else buys them from us and they make a lot of money. We produce a car for $20,000, they sell the car for $40,000. And all they do is a bit of marketing. So we're going to get into that game. There's lots of money there. We're going to have our own network and we'll sell our own cars directly. So you buy, we're Ford, we make the car, you buy the car from Ford. That's it. So we're into the car retail bit. Now, you know what? A lot of these spare parts we buy are pretty expensive too. Like this tyre game's great. Like tyres are $400, $500 each. Really only costs about $50 to make those things. So we're going to make our own tyres too, because we can make a heap of money on making tyres. And we can sell them not only in our cars that we sell, but then we can sell them back to the market who buy our cars later on. So let's make our own tyres as well, because that's going to be a good way. And plus, car sales and tyre sales, they probably run to a different economic cycle. People keep their cars longer when economic downturn, so our car sales will go down, but because they're keeping their cars longer, they're going to buy more tyres. So our tyre business is probably going to get more sales. Now, probably not really going to balance out the downturn in selling their cars, but every little bit helps. So vertical diversification, vertical integration provides more spread over the long term in terms of business. Outsourcing. So when an organisation has a high level of vertical integration, so lots of things going on, and then it says, okay, it's too much. So one of the ways of getting rid of some of the business units is to outsource and say, well, okay, we used to do vertically integrated into distribution. That's how we got our cars out to the market across Australia.
Doesn't that create the black markets? Doesn't that create the possibility of evading taxes in the corporations?
Outsourcing is a way of evading taxes. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
You see a lot of outsourcing being done from Australia to the other parts of the world, mostly information technology, which I have a lot of interest in.
Yeah.
And I find a lot of projects which are major here in Melbourne, bigger in Bangalore.
Right.
Doesn't that create a gap between the understanding of processes like in India and also create a whole of that could create jobs here in Australia?
Yeah. Sorry, but I'm getting confused between the black market issue.
There's also you can see various things here. I work in a blue-collar employee here at the department, right? And I'm a outsourced employee of a major retailer.
Right.
And I find myself thinking that I'm working hard than the ones that work directly on the machine.
Yeah.
But get paid less, even though they're lower than the minimum wage.
Right.
It's kind of a black market, I guess.
Well, it's not really black market in the sense that the company's
It's
still
the way of
cost.
the way of finding cheap labor.
That could be the case, but from a strategic perspective, finding cheap labour is good thing.
That might be that.
From an ethical perspective, in terms of responsibility to the community, yeah, absolutely. And that whole issue around... Yeah, but that's quite different to what we're talking about. But yeah, from an ethical perspective, yes, of course, appropriate salaries are a requirement. Point you made about outsourcing is that yes, you can get the work done at a lower cost if you outsource to different countries. Ethically, is that an issue? Does the organisation have a responsibility to employ people from the home country? Yes, it does. On the other hand, you can't expect them to do that if it's necessary to be competitive. So I think most organisations, and if you looked at Australian organisations, you went back to the 1950s, then basically they employed pretty much 100% local staff, and they were very proud about that. They did literally everything in Australia, and they bought from other Australian companies. It was very mercantile, in fact. Everything was done locally, and it didn't really make any difference whether the raw material or product could be purchased more cheaply overseas. It tended to be done locally. And transportation costs and risk and complexity and delay to protect all of that. So yes, you could buy a car that was made in Malaysia more cheaply than the one that was made in Australia. But by the time we got it here and there wasn't much support and all of the other problems, it lost a lot of attractiveness. So there was a lot of protection for having a high level local industry. But then as all these barriers went down, then suddenly the Malaysian car is available in the market and it sells for $20,000. Car sells for $40,000. So then the organisation starts to look at the issue, well, do we go out of business and we employ nobody, or do we start to outsource and buy the parts cheaper so that we can continue to compete? So on one hand, you can say they have an obligation to employ locals, but on the other hand, they also have an obligation to maintain employment. And any of these organisations will say, we're downsizing, we're shutting down this can continue to operate. So for those people who keep their jobs, that's good for them. Otherwise, we're just going to shut down and no one keeps their jobs. So where's the balance point? And most organisations will say that they operate at that balance point, where they outsource what they have to continue to be competitive. And if they were to outsource less, then they wouldn't make sales. So that's quite difficult. Or it's a lose-lose situation, possibly, depending on your perspective. But yes, so outsourcing is a very common practice now, particularly in certain intensive areas. And sometimes some countries are just better at doing things, and this is okay too. So, for example, there used to be a lot of shoe manufacture in Melbourne. Lots and lots of smaller shoe factories that made not custom shoes, but relatively small volumes of fashion shoes. And there's a good market for that, and there's this subtle difference between the markets. So Italian shoes, people buy Italian shoes here, but there was a market for Australian shoes here, which was slightly different style and structure and construction. So that they had a legitimate and appropriate market. However, what drove them out of Melbourne was not prices, was not competition with imports, it was availability of raw materials. Because it wasn't a big market here, slowly but surely all of the suppliers of leather and soles and laces and things all shifted their attention to where the volumes of activity were, like in China. And literally the shoe manufacturing industry in Australia moved out of Australia because they couldn't access raw materials. Their suppliers all went. So now we still have the shoe companies in Australia, but they outsource 100% of production. And they'll say to you, it's not really because it wasn't economical, because this segment of the market they were actually relatively efficient in that, and they could compete quite well, but they couldn't get the materials. Or if they could finally get the materials, they were so expensive that they still weren't able to compete. So different factors will drive organisations to outsource, but ultimately they're around the economics of the operations. But as I said, sometimes the subcontractor can do the job better. Cleaning is a classic example. Your average manufacturing organisation is not particularly good at managing a cleaning process. And they say, but then there's this firm of professional cleaners. They've got the latest technology. They do the training. We only need 3 cleaning staff. It's a big deal to try and run a separate training program for 3 cleaning staff. So instead, we just have them come through and they do it, and it's cheaper and it's better. So sometimes the outsourcing organisation to which the activity is outsourced provides a better service. Okay, let's get on to portfolio analysis now. So a large diversified organisation that's been diversified for 50 years will find it's got a real portfolio of businesses. Some businesses bought in the hope that they'll do well. It's a small growing business. They're going gangbusters. We're going to buy them while we can afford them. Existing businesses that they've had for 100 years, all sorts of different organisations making up this portfolio of a larger diversified business. So what's going on here? Well, BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, came up with this idea a long time ago, but it was a simple way to explain to the senior managers how they can make decisions about what to buy, what to sell. And so they had these 4 categories, and they said, where everything was going really well, then you're making lots of money, so they're your stars. So the market's growing, you've got a big market share, this is a real top-notch business, all the indicators, you've got everything right, stick with that one, that's really good, getting great return. If, however, you've got a big market share, but the market's not growing, it's a really mature market. And I'm going to choose the example of the milk market, since we refer to these as cash cows. You can imagine what's happening with milk sales in Australia, not much. The market's not growing, it just grows on the basis of the population. Australians consume a very predictable amount of milk, and it's not going to go up and it's not going to go down. And if it does, the trend is going to take like 10 years. So you can't really convince people to buy more milk, and basically you could probably not stop them from buying milk either unless you came up with some terrible health report. They're just going to buy milk at the same rate. So no market growth really there, just very slow, just equal to the population growth, maybe also equal to equivalent to economic prosperity. so probably also equal to the economic growth of the country, but slow, a couple of percent. But you're the major milk provider. So, not bad, you've got a big chunk of the market. Drawback is that because the market is flat, everyone's competing to try and get into market share. So profit margins are not great. But the good side is that you've been making milk for so long, or processing milk and distributing milk for so long, you're really efficient at it. You fine-tune that process right down. There is not, it runs perfectly. So it's very easy to manage. You're really efficient. And your margin is okay. It's not fantastic, but it's not bad, and it's very predictable. So those are the cash cows. There's a large volume of activity, not a massive profit margin, but not a massive requirement for investment. It's easy to run that business. So the cash cows are very much what the organisation uses as its cash input base to invest in other things. So the stars, you might want to continue to develop that because you want to make sure you stay at the top end of the market as it grows. And so as the market's growing bigger, okay, well, we have 100 employees, but now the market's doubled. Now, if we're going to maintain the same market share, then we need to double our capacity. We need to have twice the number of employees, twice the number of buildings, twice the number of machines. Where's that money coming from? Oh, it comes from the cash cow. So we can internally fund that using our cash cow. What's ultimately going to happen with the cash cows market? It's going to dry up. Milk's going to dry up. So eventually, you're going to move out of that business. At the moment, it's just static. And eventually, however, it'll downturn. So now is the time to make hay while the sun shines, and I do apologise for the ongoing agricultural analogies, but now is time to make the most use of that. It's not going anywhere in the future. It's only going to get worse, not better. So you draw all the money out of that and you invest it in the stars. What's going to happen to the market growth of the star industry eventually? It's going to slowly slow down. You can't keep growing forever. And so it becomes the cash cows of the future. So the cash cows of the present feed things like the stars, which become the cash cows of the future. So always the business items are rotating. Let's look at the downside. Great market growth, but you just don't have any market share. So the potential is there, but the performance is not. So that's a real question mark. You might say, well, okay, we've tried that for 10 years. We don't know how to run it, obviously, because we can't get any market share and everyone else is, so something going wrong here. We're going to sell it off because we're bad owners for this particular business unit. So, for example, if you purchased a rental property and you said, we're purchasing a rental property in Queensland where there's lots of growth. So we should make some good money out of that. Now, I wonder how we're going to manage the rental on that. I don't live in Queensland. I'll just go through a real estate agent. And you look back on it after a couple of years and say, this is not working well. This real estate agent's not doing well. And I've tried a second real estate agent. They're not working well. I'm going to try renting it out myself online. So try that for a while. 2 years later, still not really working very well. I'm just got a lot of time when my house is not rented out. Okay. I could ask a friend there. Maybe they can rent it out for me. So try that. Okay. It's been 6 years now, and I've had only 50% occupancy in my house. I clearly don't know how to rent out a house successfully in Queensland, even though the Queensland property market's going really well. Time for me to sell that house because I'm no good at renting houses in Queensland. I don't know how to do it. So that's what organisations find. They try this, they try that, and they say, look, you know what? There's nothing wrong with the industry. We just don't know how to run it. So we have to sell out because we're not good owners of that property. We've left it. It's irresponsible to leave a property half rented. Money went into it. It's not just the fact that we wasted money, but we've wasted economic resources. So someone else should have that and keep it at 100% rental. So that's what we do with the question mark. How do we, in that period of 6 years when we're trying to make it work, where do we get the money from? Because we're not making any money out of this. The cash cow. Back to the cash cow again. Cash cow, we're going to spend some money. We're going to set up our own online website. We're going to do a bit of marketing. That's going to It costs us a bit of money, not a lot, but we need to pump some money into this to try to make it work. Plus, the reality is that we lose money because we bought the house, we're paying 5% interest, we're getting some rent, but it's not enough to cover the interest, so the cash cow's got to make up the difference in what it costs us just to own the property as well, because we're not making enough profit. Okay, 6 years, we wasted a lot of money, we wasted a lot of effort, we haven't made anything out of it. Time to cut our losses, move on. So that's how that works. Then we've got the dogs. Market growth is low, it's not going anywhere, it's not going to go anywhere in the future, as far as we can tell anyway. We've only got a small market share, nothing much happening there. So what's the difference between that and a cash cow? It's a very obvious difference, which is lower market share, but how do you end up with a dog? Did you buy the dog in the first place? Did you buy a terrible a company that you can't run in an industry that's very bad? It's possible. Maybe you speculated and you thought this industry is going to go off and it didn't. And maybe you thought you could get a big share of that market, but you weren't able to do that. So that's a possibility, but it's two bad mistakes. So it's more likely it's your cash cow, or possibly a failed start, where after time the industry growth has gone flat, there's nothing more happening, and perhaps you've over-milked the cash cow and you really didn't invest enough in it, and you were the premium milk producer, but all the other milk companies have got the high health milk and the high vitamin milk and the longevity milk, and you just got milk. And so in a highly competitive market, you've gone from, suddenly you lose your market share because people don't want just milk anymore. And the other companies sort of spent the last 5 years thinking about how they might make their milk a little bit more attractive, and you didn't, because you're just busy sucking money out of that business unit and you let it just go. And so your market share falls away. And so the cash cow of the past becomes the dog of the future. So that can happen. You can just buy something that just never worked, or it could be your star that failed, or it could even be the question mark, where you had this business, you had a poor market share, you hung on to it and hung on to it and hung on to it, hoping to get your market share up, and while you're owning it, the market growth started to falter and weaken, and so now the market growth's poor, and you still aren't any good at it. So it could be a question mark as well. So generally, in that category, there's no reason to be in that business any longer. It's time to divest. Okay, so that's the BCG diagram. I just talked you through that table, so we don't need to worry about that. So let's think about what, at the corporate strategy level, we can do to make our business units work better. So one of the things is this idea of envisaging, which is really basically looking for new opportunities, saying, you know what, this star needs a bit more money, let's get it growing a bit, let's take a bit more money from other areas. It's time to diversify, it's time to horizontally diversify, it's time to, or horizontally integrate, it's time to vertically integrate. So those are the, let's look into the future and work out where we should be next things. Facilitating synergies. If the organisation owns 5 different business units, the managers of those business units are absolutely not interested in cooperating with the other business units, because they're busy with their own business unit. They're focused on that. All of their KPIs, everything is about running their business unit. And even though there's an opportunity for the two to work better, the manager's perception of the disruption that will create of trying to actually cooperate relative to the benefit is such that they're better off just sticking with what they do. So it's quite difficult to get managers and the general manager of a business unit, for example, to work cooperatively with another in any serious way. So it's often the head office that sort of has to force this all to happen. So the synergies are often need to be a little bit forced on the organisation, because the natural silo effects of having separate business units will tend to stop them cooperating. Then there is development of capabilities. So the organisation again will be primarily focused on trying to achieve what's being put in front of it. If you want to grow the business units, then you need to encourage them. So when Wesfarmers purchased Coles, for example, Coles supermarket chain, as part of their unrelated diversification, Coles wasn't performing well. That's why they're able to buy it. They didn't pay a little bit too much for it as well, which they admitted afterwards. But they really wanted to be in that business. They really wanted to add that to their portfolio. So what they did was, remember I talked about the fact that the options for acquiring business units are relatively limited. They paid a bit too much in order to be able to purchase it. That's another way to get a business unit. It's another way to get a house too. If you really want a house in a particular street, you can knock on all the doors and say, what's your house worth? Oh, my house is worth $1 million. I'll offer you 2. Someone's going to say yes. So they coached Coles. They really provided a lot of support and encouragement, a little bit of resources, all the sorts of things that coaches offer at the organisational level, and have brought Coles' efficiency up considerably. So now it's a much more successful business unit. So they coached it, and they took a not struggling business unit, but a business with some difficulties up to being a high-performing business unit. And that's what Wesfarmers does really well. It's very good at getting business units and lifting their performance, which is why it's a very good, highly diversified business owner. Providing central services. Wesfarmers provides a centralised finance service. So they, because of the aggregated value of the entire organisation, their finance capabilities are very large, and they have high economies of scale, and they also have really good buying power. So whereas any one of their individual business units would, for example, have more trouble gaining access to capital for development, Wesfarmers is able to move their cash around inside the organisation, bring in new cash relatively easily because of their size and their credibility. And they can also intervene, which is the flip side of the coaching, where they say, okay, look, it's time to sell down part of that business unit because you're not performing well. We're going to have to drop down to a smaller, leaner organisation to make this economically viable. Again, very difficult from within the organisation to do, because it was what we were talking about before. Well, you've got to shed 1/3 of your staff, you've got to disappoint some customers, got to get rid of some of your suppliers. Very difficult things to do. But driven from outside, the corporate said, you know, it's really time. And to make it easy, we're not going to give you a choice. You're going to have to get rid of 1/3 of your staff. We're just going to require that of you, and the decision's been taken out of your hands, so you don't have the tension between your suppliers, your customers, and your employees that encourages you to keep running the way the business is. So it's a sort of form of coaching in a way. I just popped this one in because I thought this was quite an interesting way. This is looking at the different types of business units that you would see looking at the organisation from a corporate level. Before, when we looked at the BCG diagram, we're sort of looking slightly lower down, closer to the business level. We're just comparing. But this is much more of a helicopter view, where we can see that we've got a range of different perspectives. So we've got 2 dimensions, which is on the horizontal scale, we've got the level of capability of the organisation of being a good corporate parent relative to what that organisation needs. So we talked about Wesfarmers being a really good owner of retail outlets like Coles. They're not bad at owning infrastructure companies, energy providers, mining companies. They're okay with that. But if they were to go into aerospace or space transport, that's outside their area because it's so high tech. So they're okay with digging holes, doing retail, that sort of stuff, but that would be too high tech for them. So that would be an example of a poor fit between their capabilities, which are all around building buildings and things like that, and building good supply chains and building good customer relationships. The fit between running a, so Australia's supposed to be finally getting in the future a spaceport from which rockets will be launched. And so obviously they'll be looking at for companies to fund. So theoretically, Wesfarmers could buy into that. But that's an example of something that they know absolutely nothing about in terms of how you establish, what you should establish and how you establish it. They don't know how to bring in highly skilled scientists What they do know is how to build a really good supply chain. They do know how to spend money, which is part of building this infrastructure, but more of it will be outsourced. So they're not so good at outsourcing. So for them, the spaceport would be a very alien business, whereas for them, coals and mining and so forth is sort of their heartland business. Then there's this third group where it's a poor fit, but the critical success factors and the resources of the organisation aren't so bad. So it's more about, well, we sort of know what this is about, this industry. We can put ourselves in their position. It's quite different to what we normally do, so we're not good at it, but it's not that dissimilar either. So we would be able to translate what we currently do to that area. So, for example, if we stick with the space flight, Elon Musk makes cars and he makes high-tech cars, and so he says, look, it's got not much to do with space flight, but on the other hand, I feel we can extend ourselves to that. But he wouldn't be any good at extending himself to hairdressing salons or something like that, because he doesn't have anything to offer. So that would be an alien business. But he said, you know what? Building a high-tech car, starting from scratch, building spacecraft. There's a few similarities there. They've both got a lot of technology. You need a lot of scientists. You've got to wait a long time. Then you bring the product in, and you don't really expect that product to be successful. But that will lead to the successful products. You've got to have a big centralised location. You've got a very specialised market. I know these things. We're sort of familiar with this stuff. But one's a car and one's a rocket, so they're not that similar, but we can empathise with what it would be like. So that's a ballast business. It's unclear. It's a bit like the dog, really. It's unclear because on one level, you can probably offer it some good value. You know, you can give it some money, you're fantastic at project management, a couple of really good things that you could put to that. But generally, you don't know anything about the market. It's really difficult to know what to do with that. So you can help it work well, but you don't really know what to do with it. So that's a ballast business. It's unclear. And then at the bottom corner, we've got the value trap businesses, which are the ones where the organisation really knows how to run it, but it doesn't have any of the skills. You know exactly what you need to do. This is an easy industry. We're very familiar with this type of industry, but it requires a whole range of things that we just don't know how to do. So if you have a business unit in that category, you can understand what should happen, but you've got no way of coaching it or helping it to improve. So you've just acquired that and cross your fingers that they can manage to do it on their own, because you can say, okay, we can give you some money. Beyond that, we understand exactly what you're talking about and how you do it, but we don't know anything about that stuff at all. We don't have any transferable capabilities or skills or knowledge. So that's a more of a corporate headquarters centric perspective, where you're looking at what can we give out. With the portfolio analysis, we're just looking at comparing the business units and saying one compares to another. This is a star, this is a cash cow, money from cash cow to star. But it doesn't really think about very much what the corporate headquarters does. But this is more about how close is that business to us? How well can we understand what that business should be doing? How well how much can we help that business? When we can understand it and we can help it, it's a really key business for us. We can do a really good job with as a corporate owner. If we can just understand it, or we can just help it, then there's some real questions about that. Maybe we can get it right, maybe we can't. If we can't understand it and we can't help it, then we shouldn't be owning it. Okay, so that's just a description of that. We're already there. So just looking at those value-adding activities a little bit more, envisaging, setting a larger vision, saying we need to diversify more into this area, we need to diversify less into this area. The way the world economy is working out, at least in the sorts of businesses that we have, vertical integration is probably a good idea, so we're going to start to vertically integrate a little bit more. Outsourcing is really important these days. We used to outsource to India, to China. We're going to sort of outsource to India more now than we used to across all of our business units. As I said, facilitating synergies, forcing the different business units to share and cooperate when it's not at the top of their agenda to do so. The coaching, improving performance, centralising services like finance, and intervening where you just say, look, we're going to make this hard decision for you because we know you can't make it, it's too difficult, and so we're going to do that one for you. So we've already talked about that. Now, value destroying activities, because that's important as well. When you are sitting remotely from your business units and you're trying to work out what you should do, it's quite easy to do the wrong thing because you're not there day to day. You're guessing that you will help by coaching and intervening, but you may not. You might say, look, the best thing for this business unit is to shoot 30% of their staff and become more efficient. But you might be wrong because you might lose the wrong 30% of the staff. And that's the classic one. When you downsize, you tend to lose your best staff, not your worst staff. But the corporate parent expectation is that this will be uniform, or perhaps you can get rid of the worst staff. But most organisations find they get rid of their best staff because those are the people who can go off quickly to another job. Yeah, I'll take the package, thanks, and I was already being offered another job somewhere else, so that's absolutely perfect for me. And you're left with the worst staff. So they can make some serious mistakes. So generally by their presence, well, we want this report, we want that report, we want to know what you're doing here, we want to know what you're doing there. They're adding management costs. They're making it more complex to run each of these business units by saying, yeah, we want you to do this information. We want the general manager to come up and spend a day talking to us one day per month. So it's 1 day per month they're not available to run the business because we want to hear from you, from him or her as to what they're doing. Adding bureaucratic complexity. So we've centralised finance. That's really good now because we've got bigger economies of scale. So all purchases right down to buying a biro now need to go through a requisition form that will go to the head of the department of that particular business unit. Then they'll go to centralised finance for approval with a turnaround of no more than 2 months. So now when you want to buy a biro, you've got to wait 2 months to get approval to buy the biro. So they add bureaucratic complexity by wanting to keep control. Even though the idea of centralised finance is a really good idea, there's some real drawbacks as well. But we have to buy this piece of equipment next week because we've got this major customer and they put this big order in and we can get the equipment. If we can just get the finance through, then we can meet it. Otherwise, we're going to lose this big customer, and in which case our sales will actually go down rather than up. Oh no, it takes us 4 weeks to make an approval for equipment purchase. That's our system. And look, you've got to appreciate that you're one of 7 business units, so we've got to have our standardised system, so you're going to have to wait. So adding bureaucratic complexity will create problems. Also, it does tend to obscure financial performance, because what they will tend to do is aggregate the business units. So they might say, well, we've got 3 different groups, and we're just going to report, we're just going to look at information from our 3 groups of business units. We've got the retail business units, the primary industry business units, and the service business units. And we're just going to look at them as a group. So it doesn't pick up the fact that within that group you've got 1 star performer, 1 cash cow, and 1 dog. They won't see that. They'll just see that, okay, retail's working a bit better than primary industry, and the service one's about somewhere in the middle. But in reality, finer grained analysis would have given them more information about which business units. So by aggregating things, you can also obscure financial performance. And I certainly found with some of my research when I talked to large companies about their internationalisation, I said, so how is your international subsidiary performance? We don't know, because we just consider that it's small. So you've got like 30 people. We just consider it to be part of a larger business unit. We don't separate out performance, so we don't know how our subsidiaries go financially because we've aggregated the data. Because we don't care because it's only small, but in terms of knowing whether it's successful or not, they can't tell you. So interesting. So I think we've discussed all of those in detail. So that's, in summary, corporate level strategy is all about making the largest structural and arrangement decisions where you can bring in some benefits or you can do some harm depending on how you approach it. It's about considering the portfolios of business units in terms of what is their purpose and where they're going to, and also considering your ability as an owner of all those business units to provide good ownership, to be able to coach them, to be able to provide some key resources to enable them to do better. So you have to have a degree of familiarity with what they're doing, and you also have to have transferable skills to enable them to perform better. We had the ANSOF matrix, which looked at new and existing products and markets and how you could use that at a fairly simple level. The BCG diagram for the portfolio analysis, and then the last bit about how you can add or harm your portfolio of business units. So that's the first bit. We're going to move straight on to international strategies, and there's a lot of similarity between the two. And for many organisations, their corporate level strategy will probably pick up about half of the decisions made around international strategies, because internationalising is just a form of diversification after all. So, if for example, you made chairs in Australia, you might say, these chairs are so popular, we're doing so well, we're going to make these chairs and sell them in China. So what's that? What sort of diversification is that? Going back to our corporate. We go to international markets, but this is market diversification, isn't it? It's the same product. You're going to sell the same chair in China, same specs, everything like that, or at least you're going to try to, because it's very successful in Australia. It's reasonable to assume that this is a chair. Perhaps it's also going to be successful in China. Maybe it won't be, but you're going to take your existing products and you're going to sell them to another market. Right? So that's just straight up market diversification. Whether that market is in Australia or in China, in a way, at the corporate level strategy, doesn't make so much difference, because you're intentionally going to another market to sell some more of the same product. That's the key corporate level strategy difference. You could, however, say, no, we're going to do some stuff in China because we just have to. We can't sit back here and do everything in Australia. We've got to diversify into China. Really, the products that we make are very Australian-oriented. We're not going to sell them well in China, but we've got some cash, so it's time to. We can take a bit of a risk and just maybe acquire a business or go into a partnership or something like that in China and just do some new business. Because I hear from all my friends that there's lots of great opportunities. So we're just going to try that out, and who knows what we'll get out of it. So what sort of diversification is that? Is the product the same? If you decide to go into a different market in China? No, the product's not the same. You probably don't even know what you're going to sell, but it's not going to be what you typically do in Australia. So therefore, it's unrelated diversification. Again, the fact that it's in China adds some complexity, but it's not really any different to deciding you're going to just do something totally different in Australia from the corporate strategy perspective. So there's a fair bit of overlap between corporate and international strategy, and most organisations will tend to make the bigger international decisions as part of their corporate strategy. We're going to diversify internationally, and then there's a second tier of international strategy decisions that need to be made, which sort of reflect the corporate level strategy. So we tend to divide it this way and say corporate strategy, international strategy, but the reality is that corporate strategy will tend to come over the top of the international strategy and make some of the decisions there. So the organisation says we're not going into any unrelated diversification, then you can't have an international strategy. You need a decision to go into a form of either market or product diversification to be able to have an international strategy. So that corporate level strategy precedes the international strategy. So let's get straight into it then. We've got the list of objectives, you can read those. What do we try to get out of our international strategy? Well, two things. One, more markets. Australia is a relatively slow growth. If you want fast growth, you've got to go to a different country. Two, if you happen to make shoes, to go back to my earlier example, the best suppliers of the raw materials are to be found in China. The best designs are to be found in Italy. So you need to go to those locations to get access to those specific resources. So there are geographic specific resources. You may have a major supplier who operates in China, and you have a reasonable relationship with them, but you knew if you had a subsidiary that was located next door in one of the special economic zones in China, then you get a lot more out of that relationship. So you might actually go there to be with a supplier or a major customer. So we try to pick up on these advantages as part of the international strategy. That then drives us to choose where to go. So in the example of going to be next door to a particular key supplier, then the location of that supplier will indeed determine where you need to be. And then from that we make a decision about a point of entry. So if we were interested in being in China to have proximity to this major supplier and we're going to be physically located near them, then we might also talk to them about partnership. That would make a lot of sense. We can go there. We don't know if we have a market, but you know, we're going there with some people who really looking for our relationship. We're a major customer of yours, you're a major supplier. This subsidiary is all about two organisations, so let's look at a partnership to get us set up, because then the investment is less from both sides, the risk is less, and we share our skills. So mode of entry results is a consequence of that. So why do we want to go internationalise? As I said, for market demand. It's slow growing in Australia. We've been here for 30 years. It grows a few % per year. It's fine, but it's a small market. It's growing slowly. We want more. As I indicated, location advantages. There's a possibility of a good mode of entry. So sometimes organisations follow their customers. Their customers say, we're doing so much business in China and you're not here. Can you please come here and do some business? Or we're doing so much business in the US at the moment. We need you here. Can you set up a subsidiary here? Because you're our major supplier. We want you here. Well, I don't know. We'll help you out with everything. We'll give you a location. We'll sort it out, but we really need you here. All right, well, in that case, we better do that. So, so the mode of entry can be driven sometimes by external relationships. So globalisation is a huge part of that. Going back again to the example I had of China, one of the motivations for many companies I've found about setting up subsidiaries in China as a foreign country is that the sales or the major markets are actually located in Australia. I don't mean the consumer markets, I mean where buyers come to purchase. So, for example, Shanghai has a lot of these international markets where the buyers all go to Shanghai. So, I don't know, fashion, for example. You want to sell fashion, you've got to have a major presence in Shanghai because that's where all the buyers go. And so it's very difficult. And so you get situations where people in close countries such as Singapore or Taiwan will say, one of our big problems is that everyone goes to China to buy and not to us. So we have to go over there in order to sell to someone who's in the US. They won't come to Taiwan, they won't come to Singapore, they'll go to Shanghai. So we have to have a presence purely to be able to access those international markets. So that's an example of how globalisation has driven organisations to say, well, they used to come to us, they used to find us on the internet, but not anymore. Now there are these locations where you have to be if you're in the industry. So these higher levels of vertical of integration globally are driving companies to internationalise. Access to supplies, customers are all some of the factors that drive them to internationalise. Sometimes the technology is available in a particular country and you need to be there to access the technology. You want to be long-term, you want to be where the technology is being developed, you want to establish the relationships, so you need to be present in that particular market. So as a result of that, you see things are made everywhere, and as you're probably also aware, another interesting thing is we have the global supply chain, where different stages of the process occur in different countries. Before you'd say, okay, well, you know, this cup surely is just made in one country. Not necessarily. One part can be made in one country, another part can be made in another country, it can be assembled in a third country, it can be labelled in a fourth country. And that's not an issue because of the volumes that are moved around. It's completely reasonable to do that. So now we find this interesting diversity in materials as well. So I think one of the other things is this cost of transportation, which I referred to. So here is here is something from it was a really good example. It's getting a bit old now, 2016, but the details haven't changed, so I've stuck with this one. So in 1947, it cost in current currency then, and that would actually should have been in pounds, but anyway, about $1,200. But that $1,200 took your average worker 85 weeks, or in other words, it was worth about $130,000. So if you wanted to take one of these boat planes to Europe, it cost you what we would today would be $130,000. So not many people did that, right? That was really expensive. So that stopped people travelling by plane. They travelled by boat a bit, but they didn't travel by plane because it was just too expensive. So what, of course, this meant was for all products and services, it was really expensive to ship them around the world. Then step forwards, and you can see, sort of 15 years later, it was down to $40,000. Still unacceptable for most people. Who would buy an air ticket today for $40,000? Right, that's just too much. Exactly. But then within another 10 years, it had halved. Okay, so now the air tickets were $20,000. Still expensive, but not stupidly expensive anymore, just uncomfortably expensive. So you do it once. So people started to travel. We started to ship products internationally by flight. So that changed the nature of markets. Whereas before, when you said, we grow flowers and we would love to distribute them globally, you couldn't really. There are a few flowers that you could put a container and they would be okay 3 months later, but by and large, you couldn't ship flowers around the world. How do you have to ship flowers around the world? What's the only way? Anyone? Yeah? I couldn't do that. Airplane, you've got to ship by, you can only spend maybe a day or so to ship it. It's got to get to the destination within 24 hours. It's a flower after all, it's perishable. So it was only when flights became cheaper that the global flower market started to flourish, and I do again apologise for the analogy there. But now the global flower market is massive. It's massive. It's billions of dollars per day. Flowers fly all around the world from everywhere because it's cheaper. Why? Let's follow this along a bit further. So another 10 years from the 1970s, and it halved again. Went from $20,000 to $10,000. Then you had another 10 years, and guess what? It halved again. So by the 1990s, people could justify buying a ticket. It was still pretty expensive to go to Europe, although I don't seem to recall spend. Oh, adjusted price. Yeah, I guess it was that expensive. So it was something you did, but you had to save up for it. So we could save up $5,000 to go to Europe. It's bearable. Another 10 years, didn't exactly halve, but it got a bit cheaper. And that was because fuel prices and things had gone up a bit. So a little bit more of this. Then we had another 10 years, and now we're down to about $2,000, and we'll just have a little bit more of an update. So by 2016, it's down to $1,000, right? So it takes your average worker 3 days to earn the money. So that has meant that we've gone from it being not financially possible to transport stuff by air to, yeah, it's economically viable, to it's dirt cheap. It's really cheap to ship stuff by air. And you know, and now if you look at the sales, we can get to Europe for $900. So suddenly you went from 130 over some years, but not that long really. You went from $130,000 down to $1,000 to ship a human being from Australia to Europe, which meant that increasingly the opportunities to transport stuff internationally, move your stuff and everything like that, suddenly became completely acceptable, whereas before it was completely unacceptable. And that has caused, in this period of time over the last 70 years, for countries to go from, well, you've got to do everything locally, because otherwise it's going to come on a ship and it's going to take a long time, and there's a risk and there's insurance, and it's a huge problem too. Okay, I can order something, I can have it from the other side of the world by tomorrow, and the cost penalty of bringing it across the world is really quite small. So what is it to, if I've got a friend in the US and I want to send him a bottle of wine, the bottle of wine's worth $40, what is it to air freight it to them, about another $10 or so? So I can do that. I'm going to have it tomorrow. Oh, their birthday tomorrow. All right, I reckon if I just send it now, they might get it by tomorrow. So that should work okay, especially with the day, with the time difference. So that's quite viable. Whereas, you know, that would have been, even in the 1970s, the most ludicrous idea you'd ever heard. You can do that now. So of course you wouldn't need to. You'd buy on the internet and buy locally. But the whole point is transportation has fundamentally changed the nature of business. Everything has got so much cheaper. So yeah, so this is a fundamental shift, and these are the drivers that. But of course, it takes a while for industry to respond, because you can't be sitting there in your office and thinking, okay, now we're running our Australian business. Oh, I see airfares have come down a bit. All right, we're just going to fundamentally change the nature of our business. There's a delay. So industry is still catching up with the idea of how cheap it is to ship things internationally. So cost is certainly a driver. Market, the same thing here. Oh, I just have an example. So in relation to this market here, it's even generated new industries. Is anyone aware of the diaper industry? We have the diaper industry. So that is a group of people who, mainly to support them, mainly students in fact, they go to the pharmacies and buy the vitamins, they buy powdered milk and things like that, and they sell it through social media sites. WeChat is a common one for all the stuff that's sold in China, and they sell directly. Pardon? It's not about the baby formula, but they do, as a result of the conditions in China, they sell a lot of Australian health products. And the reason is that, was what you're alluding to, is that the trust in, say, China for local products is low. Health products, they don't trust the milk, they don't trust the baby powder, they don't trust vitamins and things like that, because there's too much opportunity in the supply chains. And for personal products, such as cosmetics and baby products and food and things like that, they're very uncomfortable about buying locally. So they prefer to buy directly from country with a high degree of legitimacy in that area. So Australian meat, Australian vegetables, Australian fruit, Australian vitamins and things like that with a high degree of legitimacy. But how do they get it? Because they live in Guangzhou and the products are available for sale in Melbourne. The answer is that the appropriate people who go to the shop and buy them on their behalf, put it in a box and send an email and they'll get it 2 days later. Why are they able to do it? Because it doesn't cost very much. $25 to send it to China email, because it's a box full of vitamins and milk powder and things like that. So the possibility of sending stuff cheaply has generated a whole new market. And this diaper market is worth about $9 billion per year. And that's appeared in the last 4 to 5 years. It went from nothing to that big in 4 to 5 years because of the price of airfares and facilitated by the internet. So yes, so that's an example of how industries change dramatically. So what's driving it? The market conditions. Why are the Chinese wanting to buy all of these vitamins? Why are they prepared to buy a box of vitamins and milk powder that costs $300? The reality is because there's a large and relatively affluent Chinese middle class has emerged. So that's for most, for internationally, this has been a deal changer. 20 years ago, companies only looked at China as a cheap manufacturing location. Now they look at China as a major market. By the early 2020s, there will be 1 billion middle-class Chinese with Western buying power. So that's one of the hugest markets in the world, is appearing right in front of us. So we have these market drivers. Where is the business happening? Well, it's happening over there. It's happening in China. It's happening in India, these massive, massive growths. Government drivers. Australia has a free trade agreement with China, so it's very easy to do business with them. That just arrived 2 years ago. Before that, then there was trade barriers, now there are not. So that's made life much easier to do trade with China. Cost drivers. China has changed their regulations as well, which means that you can have your own business in China, which means you can have big economies of scale, so that becomes more attractive as well. Then it is competitiveness drivers. Well, most of your competitors have operations in China, which means that their economies of scale are much greater than yours. So if you're going to even want to keep your Australian market, you need to find a way to build up your volume of activity to the same of your competitors. And so the most logical thing is, okay, well, we have to move into some international markets so that we have that volume of activity as well, or we're going to lose our Australian market. So that's essentially what happened with the automotive industry in Australia. There wasn't enough scale in the Australian divisions, so the Australian cars were more expensive than international cars because they simply came out of bigger factories. If the Australian factories were able to work out a way to internationalise and sell more Australian cars to other markets, then they could have built up an economy of scale and remain competitive. Unfortunately, the industry had already consolidated down to a handful of major automotive producers who'd already divided up the whole world. So they said, no, you only get Australia, that's it, that's all the territory you can have. So they weren't able to have the economies of scale, and that's what destroyed the automotive industry in Australia. So we've got markets, we've got costs, economies of scale, governance, competition, we've discussed all of that already. Okay, now, an unsuccessful theory, Porter produced this theory more recently than his other ones, and it's too complex to use, but theoretically it's quite a good theory. It's got a little more substance, I think, than some of the others. But because it's a bit more complex, in practice it's been very hard to apply. So this theory says that we internationalise for 4 interacting reasons. One, because the nature of the industry we're in requires us to internationalise. Our key suppliers are in a different country, our customers are in different countries, so we're driven to do that. We wanted to diversify, so that's our decision about diversification. Then demand conditions. Our biggest markets are in Asia, our biggest markets are in Europe, so we need to be there. Then this issue of related and supporting industries. Yeah, we used to have a lot of supporting industries in our country, but most of them have moved out. They've followed the markets. So all our major advisors, a lot of our raw material suppliers, even our distribution company is now in this market, so we've got to go into that market. And then there's factor conditions. Economic conditions in Australia are pretty good, our interest is not bad. But if you want big money, you can't borrow that in Australia. The capital markets are not located in Australia. So China is one, London is another one. There's another big capital market in London. So if you want to access big capital because you're a major resources company, then you need to move into those other markets because it's very hard to access. They don't like to lend money across countries. But if you happen to be registered in that country, have your head office in that country, then you can do that. And that's why BHP Billiton is actually listed in 2 countries. It's to enable, because most of its operations are Australian-based, which is why it's listed here on the stock exchange, but it's also listed in London because that's where it accesses the capital markets. So there are factor conditions, local conditions that are sometimes required as well. It could be technology, it could be capital access, it could be economic conditions, which also. So that's Porter's diamond, and he said that these 4 factors were the interacting factors that influence decisions to internationalise. I think it's quite a good theory, but in reality it's very hard to measure these. It's very hard to work out how much local factor conditions and demand conditions really influenced the outcome. And the reason is that internationalisation is risky and hard to predict. Diversification, even domestically, is hard enough to manage. You think, okay, we can go into that market, we make fire extinguishers for commercial use. We can make fire extinguishers for domestic use, and we can make fire extinguishers on vehicles like trucks, and maybe boats as well. Sounds pretty good, but no, the people in the boat industry don't like to buy their fire extinguishers from a fire extinguisher company. They like to buy it from a boat company. the boat companies already all have deals with international fire extinguishers, so that market's closed. But you don't know that until you try it. So even a very related diversification has still got a high degree of risk. International diversification is the most risky of all, and so it's really, really difficult to work out what factors actually genuinely influence the success or failure of an international diversification. So whilst this theory is quite good, the reality is it's really hard to measure, and so no one's ever really been successful in using this to, for strategic planning, either at the company or the government level. So I think it's a good theory, but I'm just warning you, in practice it's actually very hard to apply. I think we've been through all of those dimensions already. I think it's also worthwhile briefly looking at this diagram out of the text. Just the idea that we've got two factors that drive us to choose global markets. One is the pressure for reducing costs, that is, your industry is becoming increasingly more cost competitive, and the other one is the need for localisation, local customer, quick supply. So, for example, if your organisation was a provider of emergency medical equipment, then you need to be very quick, right? You get an emergency call, we need this defibrillator in 10 minutes' time. So you've got to be able to rush it there. You can't say, no problems, we'll put it on the plane, it should be there in 24 to 48 hours. It's too late. So you need a high degree of local responsiveness. Or your customer says, what we need is, and then they've got this whole list of very specific things. And you can be there, you know, you might be an architectural firm. So what we're thinking was a really skinny building, but a big building, but not too big, and it's sort of going to look like a tree, but we want a bit of an Aboriginal theme to it. You've got to physically be there to be able to respond to this stuff. You can't take all this by a phone call and say, here it is. That's nothing like what we're expecting. So that's local responsiveness, but at the same time, coming back to the example of the medical equipment provider, the other factor is that you can buy the stuff made in Europe for half the price of the stuff made in Australia, because they've got few economies of scale. Same quality or better, same technological content or better, not quite locally responsive, the plugs are the wrong shape, the terminology on the controls is not quite right. European medical standards, not the Australian medical standards. It's designed for people who are slightly different. It's not perfect, and it's cheaper and possibly slightly better. So then there's this pressure on you to, on one hand, be locally responsible, but on the other hand, also, but the European stuff's cheaper. Why is your stuff more expensive? So the pressures for globalisation can be considered as a dimension of cost, competitiveness, and also need to be locally responsive. So if a organisation experiences a high pressure to be locally responsive and a high pressure to be cheap, that's a nightmare situation. Okay, because you're being customised and cheap. It's like being broadly differentiated and the cost leader at the same time. That's a disaster. If there's a pressure to be cheap but not particularly locally responsive, then you basically got to produce your product and service in the cheapest place possible and ship it. If there is a pressure to, not much pressure to be cheap, but a pressure to be very locally responsive, then you're going to do everything locally and it's all customised and, okay, whatever you want, we're here, we are only 2 kilometres away from you, you can come and look at it, you can be completely involved. So that's very locally responsible. So not much need to, and then of course, if there's no pressure for local responsiveness or cost competitiveness, that just doesn't exist. So we discount that as an impossibly attractive market where you don't have to be cheap or responsive. It'd be nice to be there, but I don't know of anything that fits into that category. Perhaps a blue ocean, I guess. So pressures for cost reduction generally are the greatest. Particularly where your competitors come from low-cost countries. So if you're making something like plastic injection moulding, like cups. Now, some of them are still made in Australia, surprisingly, but most of them are imported. Why? Because you can produce them overseas and then get them to Australia cheaper than you can make them in Australia. So therefore, we note where the competitors are based in low-cost countries, then there's a lot of cost-based competition. So we used to have a lot of food processing in Australia, for example. And over the last 10 years, that's all shut down because companies in Malaysia are able to produce food to the same health standards as in Australia, but are able to produce it in Malaysia and then ship it to Australia more cheaply than we can produce in Australia due to their operating costs. So that shut down the industry in Australia, but it's created more market for Malaysia. Pressures for local responsiveness, we've already talked about that, individualised needs, local issues, and sometimes also the government as well might say we want a certain capacity. We want a certain capacity in health, we want a certain capacity in these industries because they're strategic industries or they're critical industries. So, for example, in essential foods, I don't know, bread is considered to be an essential food, but a surprising amount of the bread that's consumed in Australia is imported. And you might pick up a very innocent looking bread roll in the supermarket that actually starts like in Ireland, or the other side of the world, actually shipped internationally. We've got a shop next to bread, right? It's like a couple of dollars. But nevertheless, it is actually cheap to produce it in other countries and ship it to Australia. But the government might say, okay, that's all right, but no more than 50% of all bread consumed in Australia is imported because we want to maintain the bread industry. If something happens, there's nothing to stop these companies turning their bread off, and then there's no bread available in Australia. You're people and stuff. So we're going to ensure that we always have a viable bread industry by saying no more than 50% of all bread or bread imports are only allowed up to 50% of the local market. So sometimes there is government factors which drive responsiveness, and you say, great, well, we're a local bread producer, so where's our government support to continue to produce here? Okay, so we've got 4 strategies. Our simple one is basically just to repeat what we do, the first one, international, not exporting your products, but exporting your business internationally. So we just say, okay, we make bread in Melbourne. Everyone loves Australian bread, it's fantastic. So there's a huge demand in Indonesia, particularly in Jakarta. So we're just going to set up another identical bread factory, run it exactly the same way. We grow our own wheat, but we use someone else for distribution. Identical strategy. We'll just try it out there. We may have to make a few changes, but we're just going to replicate ourselves and pop, 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 lots of little independent business units. We've got Burwood Bread, Burwood Bread Jakarta, Burwood Bread Singapore, Burwood Bread Shanghai, and they're all separate business units. They run independently. They all run on the same model. It seems to work really well, so that's been very successful for us. Or it's a total disaster. The way you make bread in Australia cannot be replicated in other countries, so our strategy for replicating ourselves has been a complete waste of money and time. Then, at the flip side of that, there is the global strategy, where we say, okay, the whole world is a single market. Now, when we make bread, what we do is we grow the wheat in the US. Then we grind the wheat in India. Then we combine the ingredients to make the dough in China. And finally, we bake it in Vietnam, and then we distribute it globally. Okay, so that's saying we're going to choose the best places to do each stage of the process, rather than do the whole process in one location. Because when you add up the figures at the end of the day per loaf of bread, it's cheaper to do it that way than try and make the whole loaf of bread in any one country. Then we can have a multi-domestic strategy where we have national subsidiaries. We say, okay, we're going to have a China thing, and they do a whole lot of different things in China, and then we're going to have it in Australia, and we're going to have Europe. And instead of just replicating a little piece of business, we just actually have a whole country location, and then they just they can do whatever they want, and they're entirely independent. So in Europe they compete on the basis of quality, but the Shanghai bread company competes on the basis of cost, and the Australian bread division competes on the basis of broad differentiation, being an Australian bread product that no one else likes in any other countries. And then we've got the transnational strategy. So coming back to our bread manufacturing, we make this in our global strategy. We used to make the bread, and it ended up being baked. Where was it? In Vietnam, I think, and then it was distributed from there globally. So sometimes the bread got with a couple of bags old, and everybody got the same bread. Right? We had small and large. That was the variation we got. Everyone got the same bread, but it was cheap and it was wholesome. But everyone's a bit picky about their bread. We like crusty bread, we like soft bread, we like dry bread, we like moist bread, we like sweet bread. What do? You've got to have some local production. So do you just abandon the global strategy? No. The transnational strategy says, well, it all starts out with wheat. And the wheat's still ground, and the dough's still made. But at the point of making the dough, that's when the different markets diverge. Some markets want extra additives to the dough to make it sweeter. Some want it baked longer. Some want it baked hotter. Some want it baked colder. So what we'll do is we will then ship our global dough to each of the markets, and then we'll finish them off in that market according to the conditions that market requires. So part of the process is this global activity, and then part of the process is the local activity. So that means the inputs are the same for everybody, but the bread that they get in different markets is customised. And so this is the sort of idea that's done with cars, although they've been even a bit more cunning with cars. So most of the vehicles that you buy, say these BMWs and Fords and so forth, it's actually just one vehicle, but it looks different in different countries. And the reason is that they make it with 100 different options. Sorry, 1,000 different options. And those options cover all the needs of any one country. So they produce the base vehicle, and then they say, for the Australian market, it's got these lights, these seats, this steering wheel on the right-hand side, etc., etc., etc. And then you can have four more variations on this. You can have choice of colour, you can have high-tech, low-tech, sports standard model. And that's the Australian thing. So basically what they do is they come up with a whole range of accessories, like produce a whole range of different types of bread, and then certain of them are allocated to each market. So that's a form of transnational strategy. It's a bit closer to the global strategy, because instead of finishing the product off in the local market, they still produce it globally, and then they just stream off the various products with the different add-ons to the different markets. So if we were able to make our bread globally and then just sprinkle some stuff on top of the bread for the local market, then we could pretty much do the whole process internationally. But with the bread, because they want some different, fundamentally different characteristics, then we have to do part of the stage locally. So if different markets said, well, we want our cars made out of new steel, we want our cars made out of recycled steel, we want our cars with petrol engines, we want our cars with electric engines, Ford might say, okay, that's too much. Some of the stuff we can do globally, the tyres, the wheels, the windscreen, other parts, there's no way we're coming up with a range of accessories options to meet the local needs, so we're going to have to complete the manufacture in the local market. But because everyone's happy to have basically the same vehicle, no matter what country they are in, with relatively minor modifications, Ford and Holden, for example, and GM, I mean, are able to have a sort of 90% global market, 10% sort of transnational, whereas the bread manufacturer is probably about half and half. Half of the activity can happen via a global strategy, and the other half really is very much domestic, and that's a true transnational strategy. Okay, so there they are. Basically, as I suggested, the more locally responsive you need to be, the more you've got to either have multi-domestic, in which case you've just got a business unit that's dedicated to that environment, or the transnational strategy. And the more the cost drivers and accessing resources require you to operate globally, the more likely you are to need a global or a transnational strategy. We can apply the PESTEL framework just as easily to international planning as to domestic. We can just simply consider what the conditions are in our target location in the same way we would consider the conditions in our domestic location. There's a couple of extra little things we might throw in. We're concerned often about differences, because generally, with the exception perhaps of the global and transnational strategies, we're pretty concerned with trying to replicate a bit of what we do domestically. So if the culture is completely different, it means our HR practices or our production planning schedule or something like that is not going to work the same in that country as it does in our country. So in some areas, we're also interested in not just the overall condition, but the difference in that condition. And generally, for example, from a regulatory perspective, foreign companies like to come to Australia because the regulatory environment's very predictable, very slow moving. We don't have trumps. It's not highly controlled. It's a very straightforward regulatory environment. So if regulations are a significant influence because you produce food products or something like that, Australia is a very attractive place to operate in. So we're interested in the political conditions, but we're also interested in the difference. Yeah, in our country, the government just changing the rules all the time. They're interventionist, they're unpredictable. This is making life very difficult for us. Let's do some of our operations in Australia. That issue just disappears. So it's the difference as well as the order of magnitude, if you like. Economic conditions, same deal. The market's growing, the economy is growing, a lot of money available there. It's a great place to do business. Social, cultural factors, they're very similar to our country, really, in many ways. So we really know what these customers are like. So we can transfer a lot of our clever marketing ideas and so forth to that. So that works really well. Or this market has been so tough for us because of cultural factors. It might be quite attractive to go into a different market, which has got different factors. Legal conditions, again, they're pretty self-explanatory. Okay, now, the distance framework. I referred to the issue of differences as being as important as the actual amount of many of these things, because you're often looking to internationalise to access a different condition rather than just because of the sort of absolute nature of the conditions. Because you're already where you're located, you're already where the head office is, so you're already established. This has got to be attractive for some reason. It's usually best measured as distance. So the cultural distance, as I said, the more foreign the people are, the harder it is for you to know how to work in that market, the more you've got to start from scratch, the more you're going to be reliant on a joint venture or a partnership to help you understand the local market. The administrative and political difference or distance. You might come from Australia where, say, administration and politics are very minor issue. They're supportive, they're predictable. In this country, however, we've got regime after regime, constantly changing, disruption from the government, disruption from political things. We've got a chance of civil war. This is a very difficult environment relative to where we are. So why are we going to go in there? Well, we've got to go there because that's where all of the crude oil is located, or that's where all the diamonds are in the ground, and that's it. We have to go there. But we wouldn't choose to go there because the difference between our environment and that environment is that the political conditions are, for us, much less attractive. If we're already located there, well, it's just what it is. But to want to go there is not so attractive from the political perspective. Geographical distance. It's next door. It's in the same time zone. That's great. We do a Skype. The other managers are there. It's the same time zone. Jakarta, it's not that different. That's easy. It's not too far away. We can fly backwards and forwards. It's quite manageable. It's on the other side of the world. When we want to have a meeting, they're asleep. When they're awake, they want to have a meeting with us, we're asleep. That's a real challenge. I fly over to Europe for a meeting, then I've lost 3 or 4 days. A couple of days going over, a couple of days coming back, a couple of days there, it might be 6 days. That's a lot of my time as the general manager, but I can't afford not to go there, but it's a bit of a drawback. And this organisation relies on a small handful of key technical staff who happen to be located in Australia. Now, we want to use them in Europe, they don't have them in Europe. So that means our poor technical staff have to go backwards and forwards, and we're going to get much poorer use out of them. So that geographical distance is a bit of an issue. Economic conditions, I think that's pretty self-evident. All right, so that's the impact of those. I think that's a good way to do it. So we can then draw that in a web diagram and have a look at the relative difference and say, overall, where are we at? Some things are attractive, the difference is attractive, or the distance is attractive. In other areas, it's unattractive. How is it overall? So this is an example of drawing it for cross-cultural comparison between the US and China across a range of cultural measures, and the measures themselves aren't so important. but it just goes to show how different the environments are. And so you can automatically assume that HR practices, marketing practices, customer information practices, customer expectations are all entirely different between the two markets. So if your business was particularly successful because of your great HR practices, because of your brilliant marketing, because of your ability to be responsive to customer needs, you can forget transferring any of that capability from the US to China. It's not going to be valuable. So therefore, a lot of opportunity to say we would do really well in China because disappears. And you have to ask yourself, well, what's left that's going to make us successful in China? Okay, so then we need to consider the local conditions in the market. How attractive is that market to us as a new entrant? What we've been talking about to date tells us a lot, the Pestel analysis and so forth, the cage analysis. Then we have to think about who's there at the moment. Are we a really big, sophisticated company coming into a market that's fragmented with small and fairly undeveloped companies? Or is it already fully occupied by major competitors who have all the capabilities or maybe more of the capabilities we have, in which case they're just not going to let us into the market. So they're going to see you as a new market entrant, even though you come from overseas, and it depends on their ability to compete as to how attractive it's going to be. So some of the things that we need to think about is how much are we going to spend? Now, interestingly, the ANZ Bank thought that China was a good market, so they went there in the 1950s, I think. Just a little office. They've still got that. They just simply want to be present in the market. So they don't care. The scale is 4 people. It's nothing. They're just going to keep that office. Now they've actually branched into joint ventures and other things. But the original idea was that they just keep this office. So the scale of entry was like slowly and cautiously. They just want to be present in the market. They're physically there if they need to be, but otherwise it's just basically an experiment. So for them, they chose to be the first mover way before there was any real benefit to be mover, and just the knowledge was all that they were really interested in. Or you could be a late entrant. You say, right, everyone's established this market. This is the last chance to get in. Okay, in with a rush. In which case you've just got to throw everything in and take quite a risk. Then there's the cultural distance. Who's going to manage this? Do you have enough staff who are originally from that country who are able to work effectively in that? Or is everyone in your organisation very local to your country and really not transferable over to that country? So the choice of the scale with which you enter, when you enter, and how you deal with the cultural distance reflects the competitive advantage you've got there. The greater your competitive advantage, the less these factors matter. The less you're able to transfer your competitive advantage, then the more they do. So if you've got this great manufacturing process, you're producing high-tech bread. This bread makes you live 5 years longer. It's the best thing ever. You continue to manufacture it in Australia, but you finish it off in China for the local market. You don't need to worry too much about scale and timing or whatever, because it's going to probably work really well. So you've got a major competitive advantage, because who's not going to want to eat bread that makes you live 5 years longer, right? It's an easy one. And that transfers because everyone eats bread. However, if you had something else that wasn't acceptable to that market, then you wouldn't get a competitive advantage from that, and you'd be starting from scratch, in which case the issues of timing, scale, and the cultural distance become critical, as they will influence your success. So we've got 4 entry modes. These are not the strategy, these are what you actually do. This is a very pragmatic view. We bring it in under international strategy. It's really almost operations planning. And you remember I talked about the different tiers where some of the decisions about diversification are really part of the corporate level strategy. And in some of the decisions, such as the different type of international strategy, global, multi-domestic and so forth, are really a decision you made after you decide to diversify, then you work out how we're going to do it. This is the next level down. It's really an operational level, but we also need to think about the simple mechanics of how we enter. Because we can sell our bread that we make in Australia, we can make in Australia and export it to China. After all, we just talked about how cheap it is to fly stuff over. We just fly a load of bread over every day, we sell it. We rent a premise and we sell it, or we just sell it straight into a distribution network, and then it ends up in various supermarkets. Easy. No problem with exporting. Long term, it's not going to go very far because you're barely in that market. You've just got a toe in the market. So growth, market knowledge control is pretty low. On the other hand, you could decide to license, in which case you can say, you can make our bread in China, and we'll just take 10% off the top, and we're happy with that, because if you make $1 billion worth of sales and we get 100 million, that's pretty good. That's fine with us. Just don't sell it back in Australia, all right? That's our market. Or you can go to a joint venture. We've got the high-tech bread, you've got the bread manufacturing plant, let's work together, and we provide our technology and our product development and our knowledge about the bread, which will lift your bread manufacturing processes up to a higher level, and you've got the physical infrastructure and the distribution network and the brand. Or you can say, to hell with that, we're starting from scratch, we're going to build a bread factory, we're going to make bread, and they're going to want it, and we can customise it a bit, so it's going to be very successful, because who doesn't want bread? And we know a lot about making bread, so it can't be so different. We just need to be there and find out what we need to do. So all of those reflect how can you really trade this stuff? Can you ship it? Bread, yes, you can ship. Can you ship haircuts? No, you can't. You've got to local. If you're a leading fashion hair stylist and you want to be in China, you've got to physically go there. You can't cut people's hair remotely. Maybe they'll travel internationally to see you. If they won't leave China to come and see you, then you've got to go to them. So that's not tradable. You've got to be over there. The same thing is, do people value your haircuts? In Australia, they do. You charge $1,000 for a haircut. It's really expensive stuff. But in China, no one's going to pay more than $10 for a haircut. So not much competitive advantage there. So again, that will influence the approach that you take for that. Okay, so that's those dimensions. All right, so that brings us to the end. We're running a little behind schedule, but we covered a lot of territory. So the potential is a reflection of the conditions. We can use Porter's diamond, but it's difficult to apply in practice. We've got those 4 international strategies of multi-domestic, export-oriented, multi-domestic, and transnational as different approaches. We've got different factors to consider, which we can analyse using the Pestel analysis of the local conditions. Then we've got to consider how we enter, the operational level of it. Do we just export? Do we have a partnership? Do we own our own business? What's the correct approach? So that's that. Now, that's actually for this week, isn't it? We're going to do the case. That's the one we've got scheduled for. No, it's this one we've got scheduled for next week. So what we're going to do is now take a break, and then we can come back and we're going to do the case analysis. So let's say, let's make a 15-minute break, so 10 past 11. Now is looking at the case analysis. Oh, I did mean to ask, it's a little late now, but for future, I think we can have the cameras on for one of these screens and the echo. There's many people, anyone use the echo recordings here? They're not much used. No one looks at the recording of the lecture? You do. There's now 2 screens. They're collecting the data on 2 screens. I don't know if you've seen that. Now, so we can have the camera. Is any interest in having the camera? Doesn't worry me either way. Occasionally I point at things. That's about all. We'll try it. Let's see what happens. Far end, I think we want. So, no, it's not going to be on. All right. No, hang on, that's not correct. Far end. No, okay, that's, oh, there aren't any cameras. I thought there's a camera up there, it should be working. Okay, I'll just try this one instead. Ah, all right, that's us. All right, there you go. So yeah, if you want to look at the recording, there's a picture of that. I just thought for the case analysis it might possibly be of some value, but probably not. Anyway. Okay, where is it actually coming from across there, I think? Yeah, all right, that's a weird position. Doesn't matter. So, there you are. Wave to the people if you happen to be in the image there so that they can see you. All right, so today we're going to look at Virgin. So this is predominantly a corporate strategy focused case. I thought about doing one for international and corporate. I thought we'll just do Virgin because, of course, there is a little bit of international as well in what they do. So, anyone want to provide a brief description of their perception of Virgin, the Virgin company? We talked about related, unrelated, diversification, vertical integration things. Anyone prepared to provide comments about what Virgin is like according to those measures? Unrelated diversification, absolutely. Is this intentional? Is this accidental? It's intentional, yes. So who really drives the corporate level strategy at Virgin? Is it like a board thing? Branson is very dominant in terms of that, and he's got a very clear idea about how the broader, how the Virgin group should function. So just a little bit of history, where did it all start? What was his first business? Yeah, it was a record shop in London, and he expanded onto online sales, and then he made his money, and so he decided to diversify. Why did he want to diversify? You can put this in terms of all of the language that we've just been using. Well, one, he had the money to be able to afford to do so. He'd been reasonably successful with record shops, so he had some cash figures and he wanted to get more in return. Number two, because he was quite reasonably concerned about the risk of the money in the recording industry, and so he wanted to spread his risk. And number three, from a corporate strategy governance perspective, he thought that he was what? What did he think of himself from a business perspective? A little risk, I guess. Okay, so that enables him to diversify. But what else does he think? Think about about some of those diagrams that we look at corporate strategy, particularly the one related to corporate ownership. He's a good business owner, right? He's good at developing businesses. He's good at bringing people together. He's good at coaching them. He's good at intervening. He's good at making businesses do better. So he thought the best thing that he felt, the best thing he can do is to apply his skills to as many businesses as he's capable of managing. So he was able to add value to businesses by owning them or start them up and then add value. What sort of value did you typically see him do? What was one of the most obvious things everyone knows? I'm not going to help you with this one. What does Branson do for his businesses? Everyone knows. Brand, how? Being what? His personality, yeah, like he's super high profile. There was that time when he drove a tank through Trafalgar Square and blew up a Coca-Cola sign, right? He is very dramatic, and he is able to use his brand to develop all of his products. So he's able to add value. Does he add marketing value? Yes, it's probably their best marketing tool. So he's able to provide some centralised marketing. He's able to provide good decision making. He's able to make a good balanced decision between risk and return. He gets a lot of that right. He's able to coach people. You know, they always talk about how he's able to encourage his staff and get people to perform well. So he's got a number of intrinsic skills personally. This is not even really corporate hours. This is just him. He's able to provide a number of valuable strengths. Now, would he be the ideal person for I don't know, medical equipment manufacturers. Should we go with medical equipment manufacturing? He probably could, but it's not his game as much as travel, which is dramatic and personally oriented, spaceships, all that sort of stuff, right? He's into the airlines, he's into the things that are more about people and sort of slightly hedonistic enjoyment. So he'd be the ideal owner of a wine company. He doesn't know anything about winemaking, I can imagine, but he certainly would know a lot about how to get people to buy wine. So he knows a thing there. But probably the conservative nature of medical equipment manufacture means that many of his key skills aren't transferable, and he knows nothing about the medical equipment manufacturing industry, most likely, and he doesn't have a technical background. So most likely he's not able to do that. Who could go into medical equipment manufacturing? He's no longer with us, but he's also relatively moderately charismatic. Steve Jobs. Again, he's got many of the similar skills, but he's a little more conservative, he's more technically oriented, he knows how to build up an electronics company, a computer company, so you could see that it would probably be sufficient transferable skills that he would be a good owner of Apple medical equipment, for example. They probably do make medical equipment, I imagine, but more peripheral rather than mainstream. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background on Richard Branson and how he approaches corporate level strategy. So let's just look at a couple of the diagrams and we'll type some contents in. So here we've got the ANSOC matrix. I put the little mini version on the top left right-hand corner, top right-hand corner. So you can see that. So let's think about a couple of his products and where they're at. So we could put his Virgin Records in here. Where would they? Or actually, no. Let's use Virgin Airlines in Australia because we've probably got some familiarity with that. So Virgin Airlines in Australia. What was that for him? Market penetration. Why was it market penetration? Okay. All right. So it's down at this level. Now, was that a new product or an existing product for him? He had Virgin Airlines in the UK first. Good, okay, so it's an existing product, so. Okay, good. What about Virgin Airlines UK? Where is that? Oh, actually, I put this in the wrong box, haven't I? It's supposed to be. No, that's right. Existing product, new market. Yeah, that's right. What about Virgin UK?
Not sure if it's geographically decided or.
Well, it wasn't a new market. There's a new market for him.
It was a new product for him.
Yes. He was already located in the UK. So what do we think? Do we call that a new market or not? If you thought of him before as selling records, yes. It's not like he's selling records to people on the plane, which is a new market with the existing product. This is new news. So I think we can put here on. All right, good. What are some of the other things? Railways, yes. Yeah, I'm thinking of the space flight thing. What's it called? Galactic. Yeah. It's Virgin Galactic, isn't it, or something ridiculous? Is it? Is that the correct name? Yeah. Okay. Good. So what's that? It's still a plane of sorts. It's clearly a different market, right? Because it's very expensive and you don't go anywhere exactly either. You're not going to the moon for a holiday. So it's a new market. So we can take definitely its horizontal line. Is it a new product or it is an existing product? New product? It's a new product. There's not, yeah, it goes in the air, but that's about where it stops. The whole thing, you buy, so Virgin Australia, for example, it's all about buying tickets and fronting up at the airport and all of those sorts of processes. They wouldn't have any of those going on a ride up into the outer atmosphere. The ticket sales, all that stuff would be quite minor. It's all about the technology, having someone to leave from, booking that 3 years in advance or 10 years in advance for every flight, completely different. So, okay, what else have we got? Sorry? Virgin Care, good. Right. Okay, where are we going to put that one? Here? Okay, it's all new. All right, so we can go through each of his companies and we can locate them according to that. What can you see from the diagram already? What can you say about his diversification? Unrelated, okay? So he's new products and new markets. He's doing all of it. So what is the risk to the Virgin Group? As a result of this, how would you describe the Virgin Group of all of his businesses in terms of their likely longevity of that organisation? Well, no, they've got good risk management, but is this a company that's likely to survive, or are they definitely likely to go out of business overall? Because they're doing new products and new markets, they're spreading their risk as broad as they can be. Some of these things aren't going to go well, and other things are going to go really well. So on average, the organisation is going to have some stars and some cash cows. If they were all related and they were all really great, that's fine. But if they were all related but they weren't great, then probably none of them are going to be great. So this is relatively future-proof, but there'll be a fair bit of variation. Whereas if you stay in a related area, then likelihood of being future-proof is much lower. So this is, in actual fact, a relatively low-risk strategy because they're spreading their risk around a lot. Are they making life difficult for themselves? Yes. Does it need to be carefully managed risk? Absolutely. So it's a harder game to play, but overall, putting your eggs in different baskets gives you a greater likelihood of success overall. So, so this is actually, in many ways, this is a relatively conservative strategy. Now, he's a dramatic person, so it looks dramatic, but it could have been railroads, bus company, banana manufacturer or banana grower. It could have been boring, like really low volatility, low drama industries, in which case we would have said that was very conservative, very safe. It's just because the actual things, Virgin Galactic and so forth, are all a bit dramatic and he dramatises them to the maximum, then he's exacerbating the apparent risk. But it's probably relatively superficial. In reality, it's a diversified portfolio, which is actually quite going to provide opportunity for him to move cash around. One's doing well, I can support the other one while it's not doing well. Now that one's doing well, so I can keep everything afloat. I can sell one of these business units without caring. If he sells Virgin Care, it doesn't have any impact on the other business units, does it? Whereas if everything was related and perhaps vertically integrated, and he had, I don't know, he dug holes in the ground, he shipped it, he manufactured it, he distributed it. If he decided to sell his shipping company, then there's a big hole, and it affects the other business units. So by having them unrelated, he also has the opportunity to manage his portfolio. So he sold Virgin Australia. He said, don't need that anymore. He used the cash for something else. No problem. So it also has a high degree of flexibility. So it's another reason why it's a relatively low risk thing. He's not locked in to that. He's created very independent business units that he can spend money on. He can let them just languish a bit if he wants to. He can sell them. He can do whatever he likes, and it doesn't affect the other business units. So it gives him more control. So this is about control and effort, but not about ease of process and ease of management. So it relies extensively on his ability as a corporate strategy person. Whereas a related portfolio where you just bought your distributor and your supplier and your customers and you just moved along the value chain is a very easy to manage process from a corporate level strategy, but doesn't have the advantages. So now I put some little boxes here somewhere. They're supposed to be there. There's one. Okay, so let's think about what business unit would go at the, or where would we position his past and future activities. So he generally had, did he have anything that was in the low performance category that reflected him doing undiversified extension? Any of his business units which you think were I would put Virgin Australia here because it was just another airline, and it did okay, but it wasn't that dramatic. I would put it there. Wasn't at the end of it. I wouldn't put it right. I wouldn't move it right down here, but I would say it's less of a broad diversification. Yeah, performance was all right, but he didn't do fantastically from that. Virgin UK relative to Virgin Records, on the other hand, was a very big diversification and did really well for him. So that was a big, that was a very successful and very big diversification for him. What about unrelated and not performing too well? So this one, he's not making any money out of it, he's just spending money on this. And why? Because it's a wildly unrelated diversification. If it was a bit closer to what he normally did, so let's say, the example was given before, Virgin. It's a bit closer to what he did. It's not as much of an unrelated diversification from the airlines. It's still about getting people around for holidays and stuff, but it's also commuter and things. Nevertheless, it's something a little more similar, and so he's able to perform a little more strongly in that because he knows how to run that business a little bit better. So, yeah. All right, so that gives you an sort of indication of where he's at. So if we were to express this in BCG diagram terms, what would we say about the portfolio? Anyone just passing general comment using the BCG diagram terms? The portfolio contains what? Well, you don't even need to name each of these, but just generally, there's a variety of different. They're not all business units are not all in one box, are they? He's got some potential stars. He's got some cash cows. He's got some dogs. He's got quite a few of those categories there already. So let's. Oops, I went the wrong way. So let's have a look. Okay, so he got rid of Virgin Australia. Oops, cash cow. So we can put Virgin Australia in there. it does all right, but he didn't really make a lot of money out of it, and the market growth was pretty slow. They stepped in, they stayed pretty much the same size as they have to this day. But they haven't gone out of business, but for him it wasn't a great thing. So we could call it a dog because he got rid of it. However, it could have also been a question mark because it had still had a relatively low market share, but it had some market share, but it wasn't really a cash cow. So it was sort of closer to the centre here, and that may have been an issue. It might have been more like that in actual fact. But we'll put it down there for the purpose of the argument because it was something he decided not to keep because he didn't get the market growth he wanted and he didn't get the market share he wanted. So for him it wasn't really good. Okay, what are we going to put up here where the market share, the market growth and the market share is high? What was that? From the back I can't hear you. Virgin UK, but that's sort of a number. Or did you mean the airlines? Yep. Virgin Airlines. Market growth. Would it be there or would it be there? He's got a decent market share, but the market growth is probably relatively flat. So he's using money from that to fund other things. What's he funding? So that must be his star. Okay, so Virgin Galactic is his star. At the moment, how many competitors are there in the market? Not well, yeah. I mean, obviously there is the space agencies, but it's very limited. Is there market growth? Yeah, sort of. It's so early that we don't really know what's going on there. But if we were to say, is it like mature and static? It's not that. So we could sort of, but it's a high risk. It's a high risk star because it's right in the beginning of the market. But why is it okay? Because it is based on a 50-year-old market. It's a commoditisation of an industrial process. So it's like saying, you know, trucks originally were industrial products for large companies to own because they were difficult. But then we had smaller trucks which you can drive with a domestic license, and they're just really like a big car. So that meant that individuals can now have, you know, see the man with a van, two men with a van. It's just a vehicle, so it's no longer difficult. So there would have been a transition point in, say, the 1950s or something like that, when it became pragmatic to own your own vehicle as a sole trader. Whereas prior to that, a truck was an expensive, difficult thing, and they existed, but you needed a big company. It was an industrial thing. And so it moved into the domestic or consumer market and then opened up a new thing. So in the same way, air transportation was an industrial, country-level space agency type thing where you needed a huge sort of industrial technical organisation, but he's trying to move it into the domestic domain and in the same way the airlines are. It's still more industrial, but it's nothing like where it was before. So, any question marks? I don't think he has any question marks. And it's very interesting. If we look to plot everything, it's all here. He had this and he gets rid of them. If they're on this side of the line, he gets rid of them. So he's playing cash cows and stars predominantly, and he's got relatively low tolerance. So although he seems like he's very risk-oriented, it's more the high growth industries that he's choosing to be in, which he's capable of managing, than the fact that he just does anything. Because when you start analysing, you realise, no, this is pretty damn conservative, in fact, to be playing on this side and saying, oh, that's no good, I'm getting rid of that. Many companies would say, oh, we better hang on to Virgin Australia because there's synergies and, you know, maybe He said, no, that's it, I'm out of that. I'm not taking a risk with that anymore. It's not working for me well enough. So he's actually quite critical. So in terms of his decision making underneath, it's actually quite conservative, even though he presents it as part of the marketing persona that he gives as being flamboyant. It's actually quite a conservative process. So it's quite interesting. And that's what makes him a good corporate owner, because he's able to balance the ability to accept high levels of risk with high returns, which is what Virgin Galactic is. But at the same time, the broader, bigger picture thing is actually really quite conservative, so it provides him with a lot of stability. So yeah, he may have given up a bit of profit by getting rid of Virgin Australia, or a potential for the future, but he is focusing on the other areas where he's going to get more return. So he sacrifices this one in order to be able to do things like this. An organisation with poorer control would say, no, we just can't, the shareholders, we can't convince them it's a good idea to sell us at this point in time. So we can't do that, because we're sort of allowing ourselves to be stuck with this and keep this for a while longer. So he's very interventionist, he draws the line, and it's in reality a relatively conservative approach. All right, so let's think of the parenting matrix now. His heartland businesses, what does he know really well? Yeah, or airlines in particular. He's done very well with airlines. He seems to know them quite well. He's done the airlines. What else has he done? Does he do well? Yep. So the consumer products, which include, is he still on the records? I can't remember. I think he got rid of the records. No. All right, but he did. I'll put it. We'll put records in anyway. I'll put in italics. He got rid of it. So, okay. So those are some examples of some of the heartland businesses. What about the alien businesses? Did he have any alien businesses? Come on. All right, so let's have a look at that. Let's see if that's a reasonable assumption. The fit between the business unit critical success factors and his skills. Okay, so financial control, financial resources, okay, health, okay, customer focus, technical services. So he's got some there. What about the fit between the opportunity he's got and his skills and resources? Yeah, not much there. He doesn't have so much there, but he is a little bit better off in this direction, than he is in this direction with these things. So there is some argument for that. So there are things that he would understand. He would understand how you market finance. He would understand how you incorporate customer needs. He wouldn't understand how you run a healthcare business. He wouldn't understand how you do financial transactions. So he's a bit weak on that side. But he's not so weak. So this is an alien business, but it could be more alien. It could be right down here, but it's sort of a bit more up there. It's closer to a ballast business. So does he have any ballast businesses where there's a lot of fit between the skills, but the opportunities are perhaps more limited? In other words, he knows, but he probably can't do so much. Yeah, I think that's Virgin Galactic. He sort of struggles, spelling right. He sort of struggles to contribute to that. He wants to promote it, and once they're selling tickets, that's going to be great. It's a good idea to promote it in advance, but he's probably not so visible in terms of making it progress. He's not a project manager, which that definitely needs. He doesn't have particular technical skills. So he understands it's about travel and consumer needs and so forth. So he's got that side of things. So he's got a high sense of, I know what to do, but his opportunities to make much of a contribution beyond putting some money in at this stage is quite low, because it's not his short term. He's not into a project management. He's not into detail. So he's not an ideal owner. So on one hand, there's the potential, but on the other hand, the actual practice is not so good. So what does he need to do to be able to be a good owner of Virgin Galactic? No, that's good for it, but what does how do things need to change in order for him to be a good owner? Well, clearly, according to the diagram, he needs to move this over. He needs to move this over to somewhere here, right? Where it's not only something he understands, but it's something he can contribute to. What will time do? What will happen in time? Does he know anything about making aircraft? Do you know anything about introducing new aircraft to the market? Not really. Does that stop him doing well with airline businesses? No, because they're a mature product. You don't need to know how to make them if it's a mature product. You don't need to know. Does anyone here know how to make a truck? Anyone seen a truck being made? Can anyone drive a truck? Small truck. Can anyone have a company with 3 small trucks? You all can, right? Because it's a mature product. You just go to the shop and you buy one. You go to the bank and you say, can I have some money? I want to lease some trucks. Trucks? Oh yeah, you can lease trucks. That's good. Yeah. We know all about trucks. You can lease them. That's fine. So there's no barriers. So he just has to wait for the industry to move in terms of its maturity. And this is the one case where I think he's brought in very early on in hoping to get the first mover advantage. And so this is more of an extension for him than he normally makes. But in time, when it becomes, this new type of aircraft becomes a commodity type item, an expensive but nevertheless commodity item, where you go to the bank and you say, I want a lease, I'm going to buy 5 of these, and they say, sure, no problems, and everyone knows what's going on. Then he can use all of his customer management, his staff empowerment, and all of those skills in order to make it perform highly. So he's waiting for it to mature to the point where it moves into his category. At the moment, it's in the scientific project management category, and he hasn't got anything to contribute. So eventually, that is actually going to move to the right. So that eventually will head over there. He's hoping. Where else could it go? It could go down. I'll rotate it. It could also go down to there. Depends which way it goes. If in a short period of time it becomes more like a commodity product, more like his other aircraft, then he's fine. If it takes another 20 years to get there, which is quite feasible, then it's a value trap business for him, because he really, although he has a sense he can understand it, when it doesn't progress quickly enough, then his understanding isn't really all it needs to be. So he's looking at this and saying, oh, in 5 years' time, this will be a commodity product and people will be catching flights, so I understand that. But if he was to look at that and say, in 20 years' time, I can use this as it becomes a commodity product like an airline, then it means he doesn't really understand the process and he's got that wrong, because he doesn't understand how to sit back and wait for 20 years. So the culture he comes from has a short-term planning horizon. Other cultures, they might say, yep, we wait 20 years. We're comfortable with waiting 20 years for this to mature. But, and we know how to do that. But he doesn't know how to do that. So the time frame will determine whether in actual fact he does have the field category, the fit between the critical success factors and his skills, or whether he got that wrong and he doesn't. And in actual fact, the biggest skill is the ability to wait 20 years for it to mature. Make sense? Okay, and I threw a little international strategy one in here as well, because I thought that we would do that. Again, I put the little diagram up at the top as a bit of a hint there, so you've got that up there. So, what are the international drivers? How are we going for time? We've got about 10 minutes. What are the international drivers for him to internationalise? He's got plenty of international businesses. Let's choose the Virgin Australia one. What was the driver there? Anything? Any reason to have an international? You've already got Virgin Airlines UK. Why do you need Virgin Airlines Australia? That's a market. We're looking at internationalisation. What drives into the international? The reality is you can't have an airline without going to other countries, right? And you need presence in the other countries. The more present you are in the other countries, then the more capability you have to provide. People want to fly from Australia to the UK. They want to fly from the UK to Australia to Asia. By having a hub in Australia, he's able to provide a higher quality service because it's all the Virgin Group. Whereas before Virgin Australia, he can only fly from the UK directly, so he was relatively weak and spread out when it came to the rest of the world. So airlines try to have hubs. They usually do partnerships. So Qantas partners with many airlines so they can use their local hub. In his case, he said, I'm going a step further. I'm actually going to have subsidiary airlines. And Qantas has a little bit of that. There's Qantas Pacific, which is how you hub into the Pacific region from Australia. So the need for hubs is critical in this industry because of the customer preferences. What happens when you travel with an airline that doesn't have good hub arrangements? You have to leave that airline, and maybe you have to pick up your bags and then put them back in. Anyone flew through Los Angeles? One of the problems of landing in Los Angeles is you have to change from an international to a domestic airline. You have to go and get your bags and then check them in again, which is a complete pain. So by owning a hub, if Qantas had a hub in Los Angeles, then your bags would just get checked through and you wouldn't have to buy separate tickets or anything like that. So much easier. So the internationalisation meant that he had to have overseas presence to be able to fully support the market, and either it's partnerships or purchasing, and he went for purchasing. So if you don't, then it's extremely difficult to run a major airline. Okay, so some of the advantages. What were the local advantages of having Virgin Australia? Anyone? No? Okay, so for people from the UK, Australia is a gateway to Asia, right? So it's relatively difficult for him. He could have started up Virgin Indonesia, but that's a big stretch. for him. Very difficult to internationalise to Indonesia. He doesn't know anything. He's got no creds. He doesn't know how to run it there. He doesn't understand the politics. Australia, he understands. So he can use Australia as a hub for access to Asia. So that's a massive advantage. It's also familiar. So it's not so difficult for him to internationalise his operations to Australia as it would be to Indonesia, where he would probably not be successful because of his lack of understanding of the politics and the market and different, whether Shahara law or whatever applies and how it all works and how to employ people and how to motivate them. He doesn't understand any of that stuff, but he does feel quite correctly that he was able to transfer many of his capabilities and many of his management practices and many of his corporate approaches to Australia. So for him, it was an attractive hub. Is it the best hub? No. Hong Kong is a fantastic location, but Hong Kong's sort of already locked out. It's already over-occupied. It's already a major Hong Kong. Cathay Pacific is already there. They're a major competitor. Qantas is here, but he wasn't competing as strongly with Qantas as he was with Cathay Pacific, who services extensively Europe. And why is it extensively service Europe? Because it was started up by Europeans doing exactly what he did 50 years before. So that door was already closed to him. So for him, he felt Australia was a fair entry point. And access to Asia, familiar. And one more. Cheap. Relatively cheap. Airport use. So you've got to pay airport rental. If you buy a ticket, something like $400 out of a $1,500 ticket, $400 goes to the airports. So they're relatively cheap. In Asia, Hong Kong, for example, the airports are extremely expensive, so that adds to his overall costs. Great, okay, very quickly finish this off now. So that was his international strategy. So what's his international strategy in relation to airlines? Yeah, it's geographical. So geographical diversification, but we're going to have it a bit both ways because that's the sort of corporate level version. What else have we got going on here? What's his entry level strategy? Is he, remember the categories? Global, transnational, multi-domestic, what is he? I think it's multi-domestic, isn't it, really? Because basically he's just made a mini version of Virgin UK. Would you agree? Or is it global? It's global and you've got to be like a single international activity. But it's not really, because you might fly from Australia, from the UK to Australia with Virgin. Virgin Atlantic was the US one, wasn't it? I think it's just Virgin Airways. So you fly with Virgin Airways from the UK to Australia, and then you change to Virgin Australia to fly from Australia to, say, Bali. So they can ticket you all the way through because it's the same company and they can cooperate. So that's not a problem. But they're separate independent businesses because he was able to sell one without damaging the other. So they owned their own aircraft, they were quite independent. So it was multi-domestic. And that's basically what he does. He creates independent business units so that he can sell them off. So they're not a global or transnational strategy. They're not fully integrated. It's more than just exporting. So it's a multi-domestic strategy. Great. Come on. All right, so the next category, we've got 2 minutes. Market selection. How do you select the market? He could have gone to New Zealand, right? But he went to Australia. Why? How did he do that? You guys are making me do all the work here. I thought I was getting this as the easy bit where I can sit back and you guys can say the stuff I just have to type it. So the demand was high enough to sustain a multi-domestic business. The problem with setting up an enterprise in New Zealand is that the market is too small. There's not enough domestic market to create the size of enterprise. Yeah, you have a little airline there, but it's going to be a small one. It's not going to be able to own enough planes to service Asia. Whereas there was just enough market in Australia to enable him to own enough planes to provide a broad service and cover the Australian continent and some of Asia as well. So he needed sufficient domestic demand. So, you know, the Antarctic might be a great location geographically, but if there's no domestic market, how do you support it? It's reliant on the rest of the organisation to do that. And then finally, 2 minutes. And finally, mode of entry. How did he get in? Wholly owned foreign entity. So he just said, I'm coming here with some cash from the UK, it's in pounds, and I'm going to buy some building. Originally he had a shed off at Tullamarine Airport, and then finally he moved into the main part. He released some planes, and away he went. All right, that does it. Thank you very much for your participation. I hope you found the presentation enjoyable. Next week we'll be looking at evaluating strategies, and there's the case OVT to read for next week. So please do so, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And I think the assignments are due in. Yes, the assignments will be due in on the Monday before we meet.